When most people imagine medieval justice, they picture something from a horror film: dark dungeons filled with elaborate contraptions designed to inflict maximum agony, sadistic executioners delighting in their work, and innocent victims screaming in torchlit chambers. Hollywood has taught us that the Middle Ages were defined by gratuitous cruelty and that torture chambers were as common as blacksmith shops. But the historical reality was far more mundane and in some ways more disturbing than the sensationalized version we've been sold. Medieval justice was not primarily about inflicting pain for its own sake. It was about maintaining social order through public demonstration of authority. And the methods used reveal a sophisticated understanding of psychological control that modern viewers often miss beneath the more dramatic surface details. The medieval justice system operated on principles fundamentally different from modern law. Truth was not discovered through evidence and testimony alone, but was often believed to be revealed through physical ordeal or extracted through controlled application of pressure. The underlying assumption was that the body could not lie, that physical suffering would compel a person to speak honestly in ways that simple questioning could not. This belief justified a range of procedures that seem barbaric to modern sensibilities, but made perfect logical sense within the medieval worldview where divine judgment, social hierarchy, and bodily truth were all interconnected. Justice was not blind in the medieval period. It was intensely public, deliberately theatrical, and designed to reinforce existing power structures through visible demonstration. Public punishment served multiple functions simultaneously. It satisfied the community's demand for visible accountability. It deterred others from similar offenses through fear. It demonstrated the authority of local lords or municipal councils, and it allowed the community itself to participate in enforcing social norms. The most common forms of punishment were not elaborate devices but simple public shaming mechanisms that destroyed a person's reputation and social standing without necessarily causing permanent physical harm. Among the most ubiquitous were the stocks and pillory, wooden restraints found in nearly every town square across medieval Europe. The stocks secured a person's ankles while they sat on the ground, while the pillory held the head and hands in a standing position that forced the body into an uncomfortable bent posture. These devices were used primarily for minor offenses: public drunkenness, selling spoiled food, petty theft, cheating customers with false weights, or general disorderly conduct. The punishment itself was not the physical discomfort of the restraint, though that was considerable, especially when someone remained in the pillory for hours with their neck and back straining against the wooden boards. The real punishment was the social humiliation. The person was displayed in the busiest part of town during market hours when the maximum number of people would see them. Community members were expected to participate actively by jeering, throwing rotten vegetables, and publicly declaring their own moral superiority over the offender. Children were brought to witness these spectacles and often encouraged to throw things, learning through direct participation that certain behaviors brought public shame and exclusion. For someone living in a small medieval town where reputation was everything and community approval meant economic survival, this public degradation could be devastating. Even after being released from the stocks or pillory, the person had to continue living among people who had witnessed their humiliation, and that social stain could persist for years. The gendered nature of medieval punishment becomes particularly evident when examining devices like the scold's bridle, also called the brank. This was an iron cage fitted over a woman's head with a metal plate that pressed down on her tongue, preventing speech. It was used almost exclusively on women accused of being scolds, gossips, nags, or otherwise using their voices in ways that men in authority found objectionable. The scold's bridle was not about extracting information or compelling confession, but about silencing and humiliating women who violated social expectations about female behavior. A woman might be paraded through town wearing the bridle, a spectacle that communicated powerful messages about women's proper place and the consequences of verbal defiance. The device reveals how medieval justice was deeply embedded in maintaining not just legal order but social hierarchies based on gender, class, and status. Understanding medieval torture also requires understanding a major shift in how truth was determined. In the early medieval period, many legal disputes were resolved through trial by ordeal procedures where the accused would undergo some physical test like carrying hot iron or being submerged in water, and the outcome was believed to reveal God's judgment about their guilt or innocence. The logic was that God would intervene to protect the innocent and reveal the guilty through their bodies' responses. By the later medieval period, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals, secular legal systems increasingly turned to judicial torture as a way to extract confessions. This represented a fundamental philosophical shift from relying on divine revelation to employing human-administered procedures to compel the truth. Torture became legally regulated, governed by specific rules about when it could be applied and under what circumstances. It was not random cruelty but a formal judicial procedure, which made it in some ways more systematic and therefore more insidious than the chaotic violence of earlier periods. If this kind of historical investigation interests you, if you appreciate approaches to the past that challenge popular myths, and examine the uncomfortable realities of how justice systems actually functioned, then please consider subscribing to this channel. We're committed to presenting history as it was documented, not as it's been dramatized, and your support helps us continue this work. When people think about medieval torture, certain devices immediately come to mind. Their names alone, evoking visceral reactions. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the Judas cradle. These instruments have achieved legendary status in popular culture, featured prominently in films, novels, and sensationalist museum exhibits. But the historical reality of these devices is far more complex and in many cases far less dramatic than the mythology surrounding them. Separating the genuine historical record from later fabrications and exaggerations reveals that our modern image of the medieval torture chamber owes more to Victorian sensationalism and early modern propaganda than to actual medieval practice. The rack is perhaps the most historically documented of the famous torture devices, and it genuinely was used during the medieval and early modern periods, though not as universally or as frequently as popular culture suggests. The rack was a wooden frame with rollers at each end to which a person's wrists and ankles were bound with rope. The rollers could be turned to stretch the body, causing extreme pain in the joints and potentially causing permanent damage to ligaments and tendons. In England, the rack was kept in the Tower of London and its use required authorization from the Privy Council or the monarch. It was employed primarily in cases of suspected treason or heresy where authorities believed that ACCUSED possessed information about plots or conspirators that needed to be extracted. The legal framework surrounding the rack's use was quite specific. Confessions obtained under torture were technically inadmissible in many jurisdictions unless the accused later confirmed them freely, which created a legal fiction where authorities would apply the rack, obtain a confession, then ask the person to repeat it afterward, claiming it was now given voluntarily. The rack was never a tool for common criminals or used for minor offenses. It was reserved for cases deemed threatening to state security or religious orthodoxy, which means that, in practical terms, relatively few people ever experienced it. The device also had significant limitations from the perspective of those using it. Medical knowledge of the period recognized that extreme physical duress could cause a person to say anything to make the pain stop, which meant confessions extracted this way were often unreliable. People would confess to crimes they hadn't committed or implicate innocent parties simply to end their suffering. This practical reality meant that judicial torture, while legally permitted in many jurisdictions, was actually applied with more restraint than sensationalized accounts suggest, not out of humanitarian concern but because the results were often legally and practically useless. The Iron Maiden, by contrast, is almost entirely a fiction, and understanding this device's actual history reveals how medieval torture mythology was manufactured centuries after the period ended. The most famous Iron Maiden, the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was displayed in that city's museums beginning in the 19th century and became internationally known through engravings and sensationalist accounts. It was described as a medieval torture device shaped like a woman's body that opened on hinges to reveal interior spikes that would impale the victim when the door closed. The story went that this device was used to execute people in the most horrific way imaginable, with the spikes carefully positioned to avoid vital organs so the victim would suffer for hours before dying. But here is the historical truth. There is no credible documentation of any such device being used in the medieval period. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden was almost certainly constructed in the 18th or 19th century, possibly assembled from pieces of different objects, and presented as an authentic medieval artifact to capitalize on the Victorian era's fascination with medieval cruelty. Similar devices in other museums have been traced to the same period and shown to be fabrications or radical reconstructions with no authentic medieval provenance. The Iron Maiden is a perfect example of how later centuries projected their own anxieties and fascinations onto the medieval past, creating artifacts that confirmed what people wanted to believe about the darkness and brutality of earlier ages. The device tells us nothing about the Middle Ages but a great deal about the Victorians who invented and displayed it. The Judas cradle presents a similar problem of dubious documentation. This device is described as a pyramid-shaped seat onto which a person would be lowered, the point positioned to cause extreme discomfort and injury. Like many torture devices described in popular literature, the Judas cradle appears primarily in sources from the 16th century onward, particularly in accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and Protestant polemics against Catholic practices. Solid medieval documentation for this specific device is remarkably scarce. What we often find instead are later texts describing and sometimes illustrating torture methods, written during periods of intense religious conflict when each side had powerful incentives to portray their enemies as barbaric and cruel. These accounts were propaganda as much as historical records, designed to horrify readers and justify continued conflict by demonstrating the alleged depravity of the opposing side. This pattern appears repeatedly when we examine supposedly medieval torture devices. Many of the most dramatic and horrifying instruments turn out to have been invented or dramatically embellished during the Renaissance, Reformation, or even later. The so-called medieval torture chamber, complete with its array of increasingly elaborate devices, is largely a myth created by sensationalist writers, museum curators seeking to attract paying visitors, and propagandists trying to make ideological points about the past. The actual worst brutality in medieval society was often found not in elaborate contraptions but in the common, everyday punishments that were considered completely ordinary: public whipping that tore open the skin, branding with hot irons that left permanent scars and marks of shame, mutilations like cutting off ears or hands for theft, and the routine use of capital punishment for crimes we would now consider relatively minor. These ordinary punishments, precisely because they were ordinary and routine, tell us more about the actual nature of medieval justice than any legendary device. Medieval society was genuinely harsh by modern standards, but the harshness was systemic and normalized rather than exceptionally sadistic. The violence was embedded in the legal system itself, in the assumption that bodies could be marked and hurt as a form of justice, in the belief that public suffering served communal good, and in the complete absence of anything resembling modern concepts of human rights or proportional punishment. Understanding this reality requires looking past the sensational mythology to examine the actual documented practices, legal codes, and court records that reveal how medieval justice actually functioned. The larger lesson here extends beyond medieval history to how we construct historical narratives generally. The torture chamber of popular imagination reveals more about the fears and fascinations of later centuries than about the Middle Ages themselves. Each era recreates the past in ways that serve present needs. Whether that means Victorian moralists demonstrating progress by exaggerating medieval cruelty, or modern filmmakers seeking visceral entertainment by depicting historical violence in increasingly graphic detail, real historical inquiry requires constant skepticism about received narratives, careful attention to primary sources, and willingness to acknowledge that the truth is often more complex and less dramatic than the myths we prefer. What aspects of medieval justice surprised you most? What other historical myths would you like to see examined with the same critical approach? Share your thoughts in the comments below if you found this investigation valuable. If you appreciate history presented with rigor rather than sensationalism, please like this video and subscribe for more content that challenges popular misconceptions about the past.